welcome to the lecture. This is all about critical thinking in a world of misinformation. So it's important for us as healthcare professionals to be aware of misinformation, to understand how and why it spreads and the damages that it can cause within our profession, within the wider healthcare scope as well. Now, we live in a time where social media enables people to do their own research, as they like to call it, which generally involves Facebook and YouTube. But it gives people access to information, and often that information is false. And this can have devastating consequences. Now, from a healthcare professional perspective, we're trying to give the best advice to our patients. We're trying to advise them on treatments and courses of actions and things like that that they need to adhere to. But this misinformation, it creates a distrust within the healthcare profession. It causes people to abandon treatments, to not follow the correct guidelines, and it can have devastating consequences. I mean, we think of the current situation, particularly with COVID, and the amount of false information about vaccines and stuff like that that's doing the rounds, conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff. But also things like cancer treatments. There's been a lot of misinformation with regards to what is deemed as an effective alternative cancer treatment. And these things cost lives. You know, they create serious issues within the healthcare community and cause our patients a lot of harm, a lot of damage. So we're going to have a look at some critical thinking skills. We're going to have a think about what kind of evidence we should be following. How do we communicate with people that are victims of false information or misinformation? How do we build that trust with our patients and make sure they do follow our guidance? And we'll have a look at some skills and analysis tools that we can use to identify pseudoscience or false information and misinformation, etc. And that way we can then advise our patients correctly and hopefully overcome a lot of these obstacles that we have when it comes to this misinformation. So I'm just going to move my camera. There we go. So to start off with, we're going to go back in time. We're going to go back to the 1950s in China. And this is a great example of how critical thinking or a lack of critical thinking can have devastating consequences in the real world. Now, as you're probably aware, back in China in the 1950s, there was the Great Leap Forward, the Communist Revolution, which had all these grand ideas about collectivization of industry, of agriculture, of manufacturing, etc. And the idea was that they wanted to be able, particularly with agriculture and agrarian kind of industries, they wanted to be able to feed the nation. They wanted to be able to grow an abundance of crops, etc. So they were completely self-reliant. And they looked at ways in which this could be inhibited and factors or things that would affect and stop this from occurring. And they looked at a lot of different factors. And one of the common factors that they came up with that was also that it was actually deemed as a bourgeois parasite. It was deemed as an enemy of the revolution, enemy of the people. And this enemy was the Eurasian sparrow. Now, they came to this conclusion because the sparrow ate seeds in the fields. So the idea was that because the sparrow was eating the farmer's seeds, it would prevent the best possible crop yields, and it could potentially slow down the agrarian push forward, the Great Leap Forward. So in 1958, they launched the Great Sparrow Campaign. And this was supported by the newspapers. This is an example from the Peking Daily, encouraging everyone to join in. Everyone must join the battle. We must persevere with the doggedness of revolutionaries. And the methods they came up with to actually tackle this problem, this sparrow problem, was by training students with rifles to shoot them out of the sky. They also spent a couple of days banging drums and pots and pans. So every time sparrows came to land, they would bang their pots and pans, bang their drums and scare the sparrows off. And this just made the sparrows continue to fly around until they became tired and eventually drop out of the sky. There was one person, however, that was opposed to this, who was a well-known ornithologist within China. And his argument was that the seeds weren't the sparrow's main source of food. And by eliminating the sparrow, you could open up issues further on the food chain. Now, this guy, even though he turned out to be completely right, he was actually sentenced to hard labor, put in prison and sentenced to hard labor. But it turned out that after they actually carried out autopsies on the sparrows, after the 2 days, they killed over 1 billion sparrows, pretty much wiping them out of existence within China. And they found that the main diet of the sparrows wasn't in fact seeds, it was insects, particularly the locust. Now you can imagine the consequences of that caused. So without the insect population being under control through the sparrows, it had a massive effect on crop yields and eventually led to the Great Chinese Famine. And this lasted for a couple of years and claimed estimates between 15 and 45 million lives. Now, that is the ultimate price to pay for a lack of critical thinking. There was a distinct failure of thought. There was a complete lack of reflection. And there was a failure to think about the consequences. So no one really thought about what would happen after they eliminated that problem. They were stuck in that mindset of something must be done. This is something, therefore this must be done. But that lack of thought, lack of reflection, and failure to think about the consequences had devastating effects and cost millions of lives. And this is the problem that we get when we don't employ critical thinking skills. We don't think about what could potentially happen and what impact our actions have on future actions. Now, it's often said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this is definitely true. And it's not necessarily the case that people have sinister or bad intentions. Often it is that they are trying to achieve something good through their actions, but because they don't follow those critical thinking skills, they don't employ that kind of way of thinking, it ends up with devastating consequences. So we have to reason, we have to reflect, we have to infer. Inference is particularly important because we have to consider the data, we have to look at evidence before we make decisions, and we have to reflect on what's worked, what hasn't worked. This reflection particularly is a big part of healthcare practice throughout all healthcare environments, particularly in optics. We have that duty of candor, we have that method of reflection, we have reflective statements. We have to think about what we've done. Could we have done it better? What were the consequences of our actions, and how could we prevent those? So these three approaches are really key when it comes to critical thinking. Now, as I said at the start of the lecture, we have an abundance of misinformation, falsehoods that are prevalent throughout social media, particularly. When it comes to discussing this kind of misinformation, this kind of falsehood that we see, prevalent throughout social media, throughout that kind of discourse, we're often told to do our own research. We're often told to Google it, look it up ourselves, etc. But the problem is that people don't have the skills and don't have the knowledge to pick apart the studies and the information and the falsehoods that they're shown and sort of work out whether they are true or not. And it's so easy for a meme to become viral and misinformation to just spread like wildfire throughout social media. And the falsehoods do definitely spread faster than true information. And as the quote says, it does have devastating effects in the real world. It can amplify controversy about vaccines. It can propagate unproven cancer treatments. And that ultimately leads to people suffering ill health and eventually dying because they're not getting the proper medical advice that they should have. So it's really urgent that we approach this misinformation, that we can identify it, and we can put things in place to help our patients, to help the people that we're advising not fall victim to it. Now, when it comes to the problems that this does pose in practice, obviously communication is a big one. Communication is arguably one of the most important skills that we need to have within optometric practice, within any kind of healthcare practice. A lot of complaints, a lot of issues, a lot of problems can be avoided if the communication element is correct in the first place. But communicating with someone who is a victim of false information can be quite difficult. We need to understand why these people fall victim to misinformation. And let's be honest, it's not just our patients, we can be victims of it ourselves. I know I certainly have been a victim of misinformation before, dressed up in the guise of pseudoscience, but it's easy for all of us to fall into victim to misinformation. But there's motivating factors behind why people fall victim. So it's important to understand the whys before we understand the hows as well. And then that presents us with the problem of dispelling that false information. And there's lots of false information that people have within eye care. And then when we're trying to educate the patient, we're trying to communicate the best method, the best treatment for them, this can then end up with them arguing against us and referencing false information that they've heard from another source that they trust, a more trusted source from their perspective. So we need to have the skills to be able to communicate, and we need to have the skills to be able to dispel that false information. But it's not easy. It's definitely a challenge. So what are the whys? Why do people fall victim to misinformation? Now, there's a lot at play. There's a lot of psychological factors. So emotion plays a big part in this, especially if people have had negative experiences within the healthcare profession, where they've had perhaps family members who have not received the care and treatment they should have had, whether they've been falsely advised in the past, and now they've built up this distrust. So the emotional aspect is a big factor, and it can be a difficult factor to overcome because emotions are visceral, aren't they? You know, when we feel something, it means more to us. So we have to consider those emotional options. Cognitive biases, we're going to touch on cognitive biases more in a moment as well, but when they've got those high emotional motivating factors, when they've got cognitive biases, it can make the efforts to sort of counter misinformation by providing accurate information ineffective. For all the best will in the world, if they don't trust you and they don't want to take your advice on board, they've got their own biases, they've got their own reasons for thinking that they know what's correct and we don't. So it's very difficult to overcome that. The studies have shown as well that even things like recommended articles with correct information, they have mixed efficacy. Some people will be a bit more open to them. Some people will take the time to read sources of information that counter their current belief system. But a lot of people will just fall into that mistrust category, and they won't want to entertain the thought that they could be wrong. And that's a big factor to overcome. Admitting you're wrong is a difficult thing, especially when you feel that you've done your research, you've found out information, you know something that the other person doesn't know. Because not only is it a case of admitting you're wrong, but it can also be a case of admitting that you might not be as smart as you thought you were. So it's a difficult barrier to overcome in that sense. But confirmation bias is a massive thing. It really does have a big effect. And if someone has that strong confirmation bias, anything you present to them, they'll view it as inconsistent. They don't view it as being in line with the narrative that they're used to. So they can ignore it, or they can deny it, or they can just fall into that conspiracy trap. And when they go into that conspiracy trap, it's very difficult to get them out of that, because any kind of counter argument you present is viewed as that's something that they would expect you to say because you're trying to calm them. So it's a real difficult one to overcome with the conspiracy. But the best way that you can approach this is through what's known as value affirmation. Now, when you have got that strong confirmation bias, the more you argue, the more you counter their thoughts or counter their opinions, the more they kind of double down on them, and they feel backed against the wall, they feel defensive. So it's really difficult to overcome that barrier. Whereas value affirmation, you appeal to their better nature. You focus on the positives they've got. If someone's doing research and taking an active interest in something, maybe allude to the fact that they seem switched on. They seem like they're interested in finding out the truth, and they seem to have a level of intelligence that they can understand things. So appeal to that better nature, appeal to their better qualities in that sense, even from a more sort of emotional aspect. I know that you want to do the right thing. I know that you don't want other people to suffer because they're not following the correct guidance from healthcare professionals. And if we sort of approach it that way, it can be a little bit more of an easier way to overcome, rather than just arguing and proving someone wrong. Sometimes we want to prove people wrong. Sometimes it's a battle for us, and winning that battle makes us feel better. But ultimately, it's not the best thing to overcome and build these relationships. So when we think about the confirmation bias, this is particularly an issue within the social media echo chamber. Now, the problem with social media is that although you can access a wealth of information although you can communicate with people, in a wide range of environments all over the globe, etc., it does have its problems. And one of the problems is that social media algorithms work on what we like. So straight away, we tend to be bombarded with information that already affirms what we feel. We're not often being presented with arguments that counter what we know. We're often being presented with arguments that support our already sort of biased narrative. And this then is exacerbated by the reward that we get when someone agrees with us or someone likes our comments, etc. And when you make a comment that it may be false, but someone else in the world agrees with it and they tick that like button, it does make that person who made that comment feel a bit better about themselves. And it just affirms their misinformation. It is that confirmation bias. It's affirming their false information, but in their minds, they're right. And other people think they're right, so they must be right. So social media does play a big part in this echo chamber, this social media echo chamber. And as I mentioned, you follow what you already believe on social media. You will like pages with people who have shared thoughts, like-minded thoughts. You will be supported by people on threads when you argue your point of view. And this just polarizes people more. It does fragment and it polarizes and it divides opinion rather than allowing the truth to come forward. There's always someone out there that will agree with you. And when that person affirms what you believe, then that just makes you believe it even more. So this social media echo chamber is a huge problem when it comes to misinformation, particularly in healthcare. Now, there's also a cultural bias. Now, when we think of cultural bias, this is defined as the interpretation of situations, actions, or data based on the standards of one's own culture. And cultural biases are grounded in the assumptions one might have due to the culture in which they are raised. This can be ethical concepts of what's right and wrong. It can be intentional or unintentional ethnic or racial bias. It could be religious beliefs or understanding. Now, this can be a significant problem as well, because we live in a very mixed multicultural society. The variety of cultures that we have within the country predominantly come from countries that were once part of the British Empire. And the British Empire didn't always treat people from other countries with the best intentions. We could talk for hours about the wrongs that the British Empire has conducted throughout the world. So there's always going to be a level of distrust towards what's perceived as the government, the home nation, who is treating people of different ethnicities, different cultures differently to the way they treat people who are predominantly from that background, historically from that country. So this can of course create that kind of cultural bias. It can cause a level of mistrust. And then the problem we have from that is that when it comes to healthcare can be seen as being part of that government machine. And that can just double down people on their current cultural biases. And when there's mistrust for the government, there's mistrust for government services, healthcare tends to be lumped in with that, along with the police and stuff like that. So it can create these cultural biases and this mistrust, which is understandable. So we'll go through an example of this. This was an example from the Ethnicity Facts and Figures on Detentions and Mental Health Act. So there was a review done called the Wesley Review, and it found that Black people were 8 times more likely to be subjected to community treatment orders than white people, and 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. So the figures show that there were 306.8 detentions per 100,000 for Black people, compared with 72.9 per 100,000 for white people. Now, that's quite a damning figure, and it does clearly show that there is a racial bias towards treating people, Black people with mental health problems differently to white people with mental health problems. So it's understandable that Black people may feel a level of distrust towards the system in this kind of sense. And because we're talking about mental health, we are talking about the healthcare system as well. So, you know, the judicial system, etc., the government system, the healthcare systems, they all kind of intertwine in a sense, and they all kind of, you know, work in conjunction with each other. So when there's figures like this that show a clear racial bias towards an ethnic minority, it's easy to understand why there might be distrust when advice is coming from the same people that are detaining Black people at a much higher rate than white people. Now, from this commission, they were concerned that the lack of uptake of treatment may stem from fears that mental health provision is discriminatory. And it manifests itself in people from ethnic minorities seeking help elsewhere, not going through the recommended routes in terms of the general healthcare system. And this then can manifest itself later on in life. And sometimes these mental health problems aren't picked up until they become an issue within the criminal justice system. So it goes to show that initial lack of trust causes people to go down the wrong path in that sense. And mental health problems can lead to a lot of criminal activity in that sense as well. So that mistrust in the government systems, in the system, essentially, results in people being picked up later in life after they've already gone down that wrong path and have those issues. So as the study says, we're also reluctant to admit mental health issues because we lack confidence in the system, which can lead to incarceration instead of mental health care, or being classed and treated on the basis of a stereotype. So if you think about a Black person suffering from mental health issues, with those figures in your mind, are you going to want to seek help and potentially be incarcerated? Or are you going to want to seek help elsewhere or try and fight this yourself? It's a difficult situation, but these problems are just made worse because of these inequalities, because of these racial biases. It does have these long-standing effects in terms of developing this kind of cultural bias. Now, when we think about distrust in the medical profession, we need to think about optics as well. So in 2007, there was a House of Commons Healthcare Committee that looked at health inequalities, and they looked, part of the report looked at the role that optometrists play. And from the report, this is a quote from the report, so it says, the problem is that public perception of sight tests and the role of optometrists in delivering primary eye care is variable. So poorer and less well-educated people are much less likely to seek regular eye examinations. This is because of concern about the cost of spectacles, which are set high in order to sustain the viability of optometric practice. This has the potential to engender a level of distrust between the profession and their clients. Now, this is the issue we have when healthcare becomes partly a private enterprise. Now, from a patient's perspective, if money isn't an issue, then there doesn't seem to be an issue with coming to see the optometrist, getting your glasses, etc., etc. But when you have this notion that people are ripping you off, people are overcharging you for what they don't see, and they don't see the value in the product that you're dispensing or selling, it does create this level of distrust. And this permeates itself throughout healthcare, as we'll see in a moment. But if you just think about how often people have questioned the prices that they have to pay for an eye test, question those professional fees, etc., question the price of glasses, because from their perspective, the sum of the parts doesn't add up to what they're paying. However, they don't consider the time, the professional fees, the service, etc. And most patients don't understand that we run at a loss when it comes to just providing the eye test. I've worked in independent, multiple sectors. I've worked in supermarket opticians as well, where prices were as low as they could possibly be, in a practice. And I often had patients come in to me and say, "Why is my other optician ripping me off? Why can't they do it at the price that you're doing it?" And I had to sit them down and explain, look, this isn't how the rest of the industry works. There's overheads to consider. I used to explain the cost of the eye test, how it's broken down, how multiple buying power can impact prices, etc. So if you take the time to explain this to patients, a lot of the time they will take it on board. But if we don't have that conversation, we don't explain to people why our prices are what they are, then we're never going to overcome that distrust and that perception that we are money makers, that we're a private enterprise and we're just after their money. But when we think of medicine, particularly in this country, now we're lucky to have the NHS, and for a lot of patients, it's literally life-saving. For most people, it's life-saving. However, it is free at the point of service. Now, we do pay for it. It costs us a lot in terms of taxes and national insurance, etc. But when we walk into a hospital, we don't have to get our wallets out. And that kind of gives patients the perspective that healthcare doesn't come at a cost in some aspects. They don't see that money exchanged at the time of service. So, you know, they see it as like a benevolent kind of service in that sense. However, they do see companies profiting out of healthcare, and that can help to sort of, again, build this lack of trust within the medical profession. And one of the big factors in this is the big pharma conspiracy, as we'll call it. Now, how often do we see or hear things like this, where the perception is that pharmaceutical companies are all about the money? They just want to be greedy. They just want to take every money. They want to keep us sick so they can continue to sell us remedies. It's not about curing us. It's about, you know, controlling our symptoms, etc. There's a lot of deep conspiracy when it comes to big pharma. And as you can see, when you see stats and things like this, it's easy to understand why people feel that way, because a lot of money is made in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, if we'd have a look at that first picture, just about the kind of figures that, you know, from vaccines, so 16 billion, 22 billion, they're big numbers, but they are for, you know, HPV vaccine. That stops people contracting cervical cancer. So that, in my opinion, that's money well spent. You know, that is life-saving money. You look at that and you think they're just profiting off illness, but they're not. They're actually, many of us wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for big pharma. Now, I'm not going to sit here and sort of absolve them of all their sins. You know, there's been numerous cases where big pharma have gone beyond what's regulated and been fined and been cautioned, etc., and things like that. So they don't do themselves any favors in a lot of instances. So, you know, we'll probably all agree on that. However, if it wasn't for big pharma, then how many of us would be alive today? We have to consider that fact. So we do kind of get into this conspiracy kind of realm where people will see big pharma as this big all-powerful entity that's controlling healthcare throughout the world, that's controlling what people have access to, etc. And there's more to it than that. And when we have to sort of take these conspiracy sort of theories with a pinch of salt and think about what actually goes into making those products, the regulation, the testing, the clinical trials, etc. Nothing gets approved in a highly regulated industry like pharmaceutical industries until it's gone through rigorous testing, rigorous clinical trials. So when people do come out with these kind of conspiracy theories, you have to kind of take it with a pinch of salt and think about the bigger picture in that sense. What we tend to find as well is that when there's this distrust in the medical profession, it opens up the door for alternative remedies and alternative treatments. And it's often seen that they're not after your money, but big pharma is, and people will kind of veer towards that, the wellness industry, for example, the alternative medicine industry, as a way to avoid falling into this big pharma trap. But the wellness industry itself is a huge industry, 4.5 trillion globally last year. And that includes everything from, you know, physical activity, nutrition, alternative remedies, herbal remedies, natural remedies, etc. All this stuff is still making people a hell of a lot of money. Now, if someone is trying to tell you that this kind of alternative medicine that they happen to sell is better for you than something that's been through proper clinical trials, and try to sort of go down that big pharma conspiracy route, then you have to be a little bit suspicious, because they're making money off it as well. So let's not fall into that trap if we can. But when we think about the wellness industry, it is unregulated. They rely predominantly on anecdotal evidence as well. So if you ever see things like, for example, CBD oil, stuff like that, if you ever look into the alternative treatments, homeopathy, things like that, a lot of these treatments, when it comes to actually proving their efficacy, they don't stand up to clinical trials. They don't perform better in most cases than placebo trials. And a lot of these alternative products, alternative treatments, alternative remedies, etc., natural remedies, have been tested. They have gone through clinical trials, and they've not proven to be better, more efficient, and better at treating, or cheaper than the big pharma alternatives. So it's not without trying that these things are dismissed. You know, they have undergone these rigorous tests, but the fact is they just don't live up to the same kind of standards. So we have to be wary of them when we look at these kind of studies. If the studies are predominantly relying on anecdotes about how many people felt better after taking them, how many people feel better in themselves, and I feel all this now, take it with a pinch of salt, because if the evidence is anecdotal or testimonial, it's got to be treated with suspicion. The other issue that we get in this whole kind of wellness profession is that there's no protected titles. Now, obviously, we're in an industry with protected titles. Our titles that we hold protected in the healthcare environment, doctors, nurses, etc., all have protected titles. If we have a think about healthy eating and nutrition, for example, now a dietitian is a healthcare professional with a protected title. They have to do CPD, they have to be regulated, they have to have insurance, etc. A nutritionist, on the other hand, let's think of a random one, for example, someone like Gillian McKeith, no longer known as Dr. Gillian McKeith for obvious reasons. But anyone can learn a bit about nutrition and call themselves a nutritionist. So again, beware when these titles aren't protected and people are assigning titles to themselves that they haven't really earned in that sense. Now, and again, governing bodies. So but if there's no governing body to ensure standards, then it's a sure sign that there's no accountability. There's no repercussions if people don't adhere to their standards. So again, if there's no governing body for that particular treatment, for that particular title, then definitely be suspicious about it. Now, one term that's used a lot in the wellness industry that is very ambiguous and something to be, again, suspicious of is terms like the word natural. And it's often used to sort of denote a safer treatment. Something's natural. It's not going to hurt you. It's normal. It's from nature. But the fact is that lots of things that are natural will hurt you. Lots of the diseases that we have pharmaceutical interventions for are natural. Cancer's natural. HIV is natural. TB, smallpox, etc. All these kind of things that are passed from animals to humans. COVID. All these diseases, all these, Ebola, everything, these are all naturally occurring. These are things that occur in nature. So when someone uses the word natural to imply that something's safer or healthier, again, be suspicious, because natural, it's a very nebulous way to describe something. So, it doesn't prove anything in terms of efficacy of a product or anything like that. Now, it's important then that we can distinguish between disinformation and inequality-driven mistrust. And it's important that we sort of distinguish between those two, because sometimes people just may genuinely and innocently be victims of misinformation. But in some cases, in a lot of cases, these inequality-driven mistrusts can force people into adopting those kind of ways of thinking and those biases. Because of the way people have been treated and things like that. So we have to sort of distinguish, are these people, do they have a deep-rooted distrust because of the way that they've been treated previously, or their family or their friends, etc.? Or is it just a case of someone's clicked on the wrong article and gone down a bit of a social media rabbit hole and got into sort of conspiracies? So it's important to distinguish between the two. But again, and although I sort of joke a little bit about conspiracy beliefs within this lecture in general, we have to be careful about sort of using that language when we are discussing this with people, because as soon as people start to believe in conspiracies, they will start to mistrust you even more. And when you kind of point out that it's a conspiracy, it makes them sound a little bit mad, and they probably take offense at it. So that kind of language doesn't help when we're trying to overcome these issues. So how do we identify false information? So what are the telltale signs that healthcare information is false? Now, we have to determine the difference between science and pseudoscience. So I'm sure most of you are probably aware of the cargo cults from World War II. So these were predominant in the sort of the South Seas and the South Pacific, where tribal communities on islands that hadn't really encountered life outside their island before were suddenly inundated with planes and helicopters and things like that. And there was a very sort of eminent physicist called Richard Feynman, who's an American physicist around that time. He went to the South Seas, and this is what he sort of said about what he witnessed over there. So he said, in the South Seas, there is a cargo cult of people. So during the war, they saw airplanes land with lots of goods and materials, and they want the same thing to happen now. So they've arranged to imitate things like runways, to put fires along the sides of runways, to make a wooden hut for a man to sit in with 2 wooden pieces on his head like headphones and bars of bamboo sticking out like antennas. He's the controller, and they wait for the airplanes to land. They're doing everything right. The form is perfect. It looks exactly the way it looked before, but it doesn't work. No airplanes land. So I call these things cargo cult science, because they follow all the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation, but they're missing something essential because the planes don't land. Now, this is a great description of what we'd call pseudoscience. And to the untrained eye, when you look at some of the studies, some of the reports, some of the articles written, etc., by people who are peddling this information, to the untrained eye, it looks like science. You know, it looks like it's legitimate, but it's not. So again, as Richard Feynman said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So we'll have a look at some ways in which we can detect pseudoscience and how we can tell the difference so we can interpret information correctly. So the first thing then is the quality of evidence. So whatever is being claimed, it needs to be underpinned by supporting data. Data is particularly tricky to understand, and statistics can often prove anything correct. Statistics are often misinterpreted, and unless you're quite mathematically minded, it's very easy to fall victim to false statistics. So always be aware of that supporting data. If you're looking into a study, there should be a clear description of the methodology as well. So the study should lay out exactly how the study was conducted, how they gathered their data. They should be detailing what potential issues there were, what they could have done better, what was done wrong, what kind of negative aspects there could be to the study as well. So if it hasn't got that clear methodology, if they're not completely open and honest about how they've actually conducted this study, then definitely be suspicious. And when we talk about quality of evidence, again, when we think about anecdotal or testimonial evidence, always consider that as suspect. If there's no hard data, then it's not scientific. Anecdotes, testimonials can easily be falsified. They're not repeatable. It's subjective. It's down to that person's opinion. That opinion could be quite easily bought and paid for, or it could be quite easily influenced in many ways. So when we think about anecdotal evidence, always consider it suspect. Authority. Now, this is a really important one, because a lot of people will take on something because of a perceived level of authority. Now, it's always important to remember that scientific claims don't derive authority by virtue of them coming from scientists or doctors. The evidence speaks for itself. Acceptance stems from the weight of evidence behind it. And you'll often find that when pseudoscientific claims are being made, they often focus around ostensible experts or gurus rather than the evidence. It's always under the guise of this expert is promoting this product. You should listen to this expert, therefore this product is good. It's a sure sign of pseudoscience and something to be suspicious of. It's prevalent throughout the wellness industry. It's prevalent with products being sold, whether that's an endorsement from a celebrity, an athlete, or a doctor or a scientist. If they're using a person to endorse it, or a guru or an ostensible expert to endorse it, be wary. Okay, look at the evidence. The evidence should stand upon its own 2 feet, not because of the claims of the so-called expert. Logic is really important. every single link in the argument must connect. There can't be gaps. If there's only a few links, if there's something that doesn't fit with that logic, that train of thought, then you need to be suspicious, because that would show that there's an assumption being made. So when there's non sequiturs, it does suggest dubious conclusions. So always be wary of that. The term non sequitur, it means the conclusion isn't aligned with the previous statements or the evidence. Something doesn't follow, something doesn't follow logically. So always look out for those links, those breaks in the links of logic. A lot of healthcare remedies, particularly when we're looking at wellness and that kind of thing, and alternative remedies, a lot of the time you'll have quite reductive claims that suggest single causes or cures for complex situations and conditions. If that's the case, then they should be treated very skeptically. There's information that I've seen on social media. For example, if you eat an alkaline-based diet, you won't get cancer. Cancer can't survive in an alkaline body, things like that. If it was that simple, we wouldn't have cancer. We would have eliminated cancer a long time ago. These kind of products that claim to cure everything need to really be treated with suspicion. You'll often see products that are available over the counter that will help pain relief. They'll help your anxiety. They'll help your depression. They'll help you sleep. They'll help your joints. They'll do all these wonderful things. And the evidence that they have for this, there's a guy on the back of the packet saying how wonderful they are. And there's loads of reviews and testimonials from patients that have experienced these wonderful side effects. Now, when you have got these, like I say, these reductive claims, these simple solutions to a multitude of ailments, be very suspicious, because the logic just doesn't follow. Scientific claims are testable. So falsifiability is paramount to gauging the validity of a claim. If it can't be proven wrong, then it's not scientific. Because if it can't be proven wrong, then the evidence is clearly falsifiable or it's subjective. It has to be able to be proven wrong to be considered scientific. And evidence, studies, tests, etc., they should all be repeatable to get the same results, essentially. So we have to be aware of, if we can't actually test those claims that people are making, if we can't actually prove that they're wrong, then be suspicious of them, because there's a level of subjectivity there, and it's probably because those claims are, again, anecdotal, testimonial kind of evidence. So again, the caveat, that which cannot be verified by independent investigation is very likely to be pseudoscience. Totality of evidence. So it's not a case of cherry picking. You can't just pick the data that supports your assumptions or supports your bias. Okay, the whole of the evidence, or the majority of the evidence, has to be collaborative, and it has to all point in the same direction. If the claim is consistent with and compatible with all the evidence, then it's reasonable to accept it. But if it clashes with the weight of previous data, then testable reasons must be suggested. So let's think about a common example with this, which is something like climate change. There are people out there who deny climate change, and they will have seen YouTube videos, documentaries, etc., that allude to certain things that in their mind disproves the rest of the evidence. Now, when you think of something like climate change, it can be seen as a conspiracy. It can be seen as something that governments are conspiring with so they can launch controllable products, electric products, all this kind of stuff. But for that to be true, you've really got to think that, could all these people all be on the act together? Now, there's a well-known saying when it comes to conspiracies. So for 3 people to keep a secret, 2 of them must be dead. We just can't keep secrets. If you've got something like climate change, for example, where you've got evidence from a multitude of scientific disciplines, from geology, from astronomy, you've got biologists, you've got geologists, archaeologists, the amount of different scientific disciplines that are working independently and finding evidence to support climate change is staggering. And this is being done not by a small group of people. This is being done by literally thousands of Thousands of scientists throughout the world. We're talking education institutions, universities, all these kind of things, independently researching this kind of information and all coming to the same conclusion. Are all those people in some kind of big conspiracy together? Are they keeping it under wraps? It's difficult to sort of entertain that as a notion, isn't it? But what you will find is that there will be anomalies when it comes to climate change. So, for example, one common example that's used is the fact that the ice sheets in the Antarctic are expanding. So in some people's minds, regardless of all the other data that overwhelmingly proves that ice sheets are melting in the northern hemisphere and the Arctic and all this kind of stuff, glacial melt, etc., all that kind of stuff. Because of this one data anomaly, in their minds, it kind of disproves everything. But when you have a data anomaly like that, you have to be able to test the reasons why that could be. So if you look into the reasons as to why that ice sheet in the Antarctic could expand, it does kind of give quite a clear explanation as to why it's a statistic anomaly compared to the northern hemisphere. So definitely something to look up. But as I say, the whole totality of evidence has to go in line, and then once we have that, then we can accept it. It's not a case of cherry picking what suits your agenda. Now, Occam's razor, probably a phrase that most people are familiar with, but it's also a phrase that people misinterpret and misunderstand. So when we employ Occam's razor into scientific thinking, we associate it with assumptions more than anything. So does the claim rely on a multitude of supplementary assertions? Or if an alternative hypothesis better explains the available data, strong evidence would have to be provided to justify additional assumptions. So if we have to make an assumption, if there's two opposing theories and one has to make several assumptions, then we should side with the theory that doesn't rely on assumptions. That is the general thesis with Occam's razor. And this came about, the guy who sort of responsible for this was a monk back in the 1400s, I believe. And his argument was that it's often misquoted as the simplest explanation is the best, but the actual Occam's razor quote is plurality should not be posited without necessity. I'll let you try the Latin versions yourselves. I'm not going to attempt it in my Brummie accent. So we shouldn't bring entities into existence without necessity. We shouldn't assume something is evidence without actually being able to prove its evidence. And this is what's known as the principle of parsimony. So the principle of parsimony recommends that from among theories fitting the data equally well, scientists choose the simplest theory. Thus, the fit of the data is not the only criterion bearing on theory choice. And again, when we say the simplest theory, we tend to mean the one that makes the least assumptions, the one that has the less kind of assumptions made that bring extra things into the equation that might not necessarily be needed. And one of the most important ones to remember, arguably the most important one to remember, is the burden of proof. Now, the onus is always on the person making the claim to support it with evidence, rather than for others to disprove it. If you're ever told the answer, well, you can't prove me wrong, that's a sure sign of pseudoscience or misinformation. If it can't be proven wrong, then it's not scientific. And it's always on the burden of proof is always on the person making the claim. Any attempts to shift that burden of proof are a warning sign, so they should be treated with suspicion. And if we have claims that pivot on special pleading to justify a lack of evidence, such as conspiracy theories, they have all the hallmarks of pseudoscience. Burden of proof is paramount. If they can't take on that burden of proof, if they can't prove what they're saying, then we can dismiss it. And there's a well-known saying that claims made in the spirit of inquiry are more likely to be scientific than those made in the spirit of justification. So when there is an avoidance of that burden of proof, when people are hesitant or reluctant to prove their claims scientifically, to have their claims or their evidence examined and peer-reviewed and tested and all that kind of stuff, then what is their motivation? Are they looking into something out of pure inquiry? Are they looking for answers, or are they looking for something to justify what they already believe? And again, that burden of proof is a good indication of what someone's motivation is. And it means that, well, again, a well-known phrase, what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Okay, so just to summarize then, it's vitally important that we adopt these skills. And they're skills that we should have really learned as part of our degree. As part of our, when we're writing dissertations, we're looking to studies. We are an evidence-based practice. We're healthcare. We operate and we provide services and remedies and treatments, etc., based on evidence. So we have to be able to understand what is scientifically correct evidence, what is falsified evidence, what are the triggers, what are the motivations for people believing in false information. And we have to be able to communicate this with our patients. Like I say, false information, particularly in healthcare, it's dangerous. And it can lead to distrust within the profession. It can lead to lack of compliance when it comes to treatment, when it comes to medication. And ultimately, it can lead to people cutting their lives drastically short through not following the correct healthcare advice. So we're in the best position to overcome these problems. We have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the training. So let's use our critical thinking skills and build on those communication skills so we can overcome the issues that our patients may have, build that trust if there is lacking trust, and overcome those biases. And hopefully we can start to get rid of some of this dodgy healthcare information out there. Okay, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. We'll see you on the next one.